On October 19, 1973, President Richard Nixon asked Congress for $2.2 billion in emergency military aid for Israel. The request was routine. America had been backing Israel for decades. But this time, within 24 hours, something unprecedented happened. The richest oil producers on earth turned off the tap. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Libya, they stopped selling oil to the United States completely, and they did something even more devastating. They cut global production by 5%, then threatened to cut another 5% every month until America changed its policy. The price of oil quadrupled. Gas lines stretched for miles. The economy collapsed. This wasn't war. It was economic strangulation. And it worked. Everyone remembers the oil embargo. The images of angry Americans waiting hours to fill their tanks. The rationing, the 73 to 74 recession. But most people think it was about war, about Arab anger at American support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War. That's not wrong, but it's incomplete, because the oil weapon didn't work in '67. Arab states tried the same embargo during the Six-Day War. It failed. Completely. The world had spare capacity. America was producing enough oil domestically. The Arabs lost revenue and gained nothing. So why did it work in '73? What changed? The answer reveals how economic leverage is built. Slowly, over decades, until the moment it's deployed, and then it's devastating. In 1960, 5 countries created OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Venezuela. Their goal was simple: control the price of oil. For decades, Western oil companies had set prices. They paid royalties to the host countries, but controlled production, refining, and distribution. The Seven Sisters, Standard Oil of New Jersey, Royal Dutch Shell, Anglo-Persian. They operated like a cartel. They fixed prices. They divided markets. They kept oil cheap to fuel Western economies. And the producing countries got pennies on the barrel. OPEC was supposed to change that, but for the first decade it didn't. It couldn't. The companies were too powerful. The producers too divided. Then the world changed. In the late 1960s and early 70s, global oil demand exploded. Post-war economies were booming. Europe rebuilt. Japan industrialized. Cars became ubiquitous. Plastics. Petrochemicals. Everything needed oil. And American production peaked. In 1970, U.S. oil output hit its maximum and started to decline. For the first time in history, America needed to import oil. Lots of it. By 1973, the U.S. was importing 1/3 of its oil. Western Europe imported 72% from the Middle East. Japan imported 82%. The math had flipped. The West needed oil more than the producers needed Western markets. Leverage. The producers finally had it. Saudi Arabia was the key. It wasn't just another oil producer. It was the central bank of oil, the swing producer. It had spare capacity. If prices rose too high, Saudi Arabia could pump more and bring them down. If prices fell too low, it could cut production and stabilize them. Other countries produced to their maximum. Saudi Arabia had room, and King Faisal understood what that meant. Power, but Faisal had a problem. He was pro-American, educated partly in the West, a pragmatist. He valued the relationship with Washington, but he was also an Arab leader. And in 1973, he was being pushed hard by Egypt, by his own people, to do something about Israel. The story starts in June 1967, the Six-Day War. Israel crushed Egypt, Syria and Jordan, captured the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, the West Bank, East Jerusalem. It was a humiliation for the Arab world, and it changed everything. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser had been the voice of pan-Arabism, the champion of Arab pride. The Six-Day War destroyed his credibility. He died in 1970, broken. His successor was Anwar Sadat, and Sadat was obsessed with one thing: reversing the outcome of '67. He knew he couldn't defeat Israel militarily, not with American backing. But he had to try, had to force negotiations. So he planned a war, a surprise attack, and he needed Saudi money and Saudi oil. In August 1973, Sadat flew to Riyadh to meet King Faisal. They talked for hours. Sadat was direct. Egypt would attack Israel on Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. Syria would attack simultaneously from the north. It would be a coordinated assault designed to shock Israel and force the world to pay attention. But he needed Saudi Arabia to do something it had never done successfully: use the oil weapon. Faisal was reluctant. He remembered 1967, the failed embargo, the lost revenue. But Sadat was persuasive. And this time, the market was different. Tight. Desperate. The leverage existed. Faisal agreed. quietly, conditionally. If the war happened, he would act. October 6th, 1973, Yom Kippur. Egyptian and Syrian forces attacked. Israel was caught off guard. For the first few days, it looked like the Arabs might actually win. Israeli positions were overrun. Territory was lost. Panic set in. Then the tide turned. Israeli forces regrouped, counterattacked. American intelligence monitored the situation. And on October 8th, Israel went on full nuclear alert. They were preparing to use nuclear weapons if the conventional war turned catastrophic. Henry Kissinger, the U.S. Secretary of State, was informed on the morning of October 9th. He immediately authorized an emergency resupply operation. Operation Nickelgrass. American transport planes began flying weapons and ammunition to Israel. Openly, massively, the Arabs watched and prepared their response. October 16th. Kuwait City. Arab members of OPEC met. The Yom Kippur War was still raging, but the military outcome was becoming clear. Israel was winning. Again, the Arabs needed a new strategy. The oil ministers agreed to raise the posted price of oil by 70%, from $3 per barrel to $5.10. It was a massive increase, but they didn't stop there. They also agreed to cut production, 5% immediately, and another 5% every month, until Israel withdrew from occupied territories. It was a coordinated economic assault. October 17th, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries met in Kuwait. They formalized the cuts and added a list, countries to be punished. October 19th, Nixon's request. $2.2 billion for Israel. It was the trigger, the final insult. Saudi Arabia's foreign minister, Omar Sakaf, had visited Washington days earlier. He warned that an embargo was coming if America didn't change course. Nixon tried to reassure him, promised to push for balanced outcomes, then immediately undercut himself with the aid package. It was a slap. The Arab oil ministers responded the next day, October 20th. Total embargo against the United States. No oil exports. None. The Netherlands was added because Rotterdam was a major transit point for oil to U.S. military bases. Canada, Japan, Portugal, Rhodesia, South Africa. All targeted. The oil weapon was deployed, and this time it had teeth. The impact was immediate and brutal. The U.S. was importing 1/3 of its oil from Arab producers, 638,000 barrels per day from Saudi Arabia alone. That supply disappeared overnight. But the real damage wasn't the embargo itself. It was the production cuts. Global supply dropped, prices spiked. By January 1974, oil cost $11.65 per barrel. It had nearly quadrupled in 3 months. And because oil was priced in dollars, every oil importing country needed dollars to buy it. Demand for dollars surged. The dollar strengthened even as the American economy weakened. It was economic chaos. Inflation, recession, stagflation, a word that wasn't supposed to exist. High inflation and high unemployment simultaneously. The rules of economics seemed broken. Gas stations across America ran dry. Lines formed at dawn. Cars idled for hours. Tempers flared. Fights broke out. Some stations implemented rationing. Odd even days based on license plate numbers. 10-gallon limits. Prices doubled, then tripled. The average price of gasoline went from 38 cents per gallon in May 1973 to 55 cents by June 1974. It doesn't sound like much now, but wages were low. Inflation was eating savings. People were panicking. The stock market crashed. The Dow Jones fell 45% from January 1973 to December 1974. Trillions in wealth evaporated. Companies went bankrupt. Unemployment rose. The 1973 to 1975 recession was the worst since the Great Depression. Nixon declared a national emergency, launched Project Independence. The goal was energy self-sufficiency. Reduce imports, increase domestic production, explore alternatives. He signed the Emergency Petroleum Allocation Act, gave the government power to control prices, production, allocation, and marketing. Congress imposed a national 55-mile-per-hour speed limit to conserve fuel. It worked. Fatalities dropped. Fuel consumption decreased. Daylight saving time was extended year-round. Tax credits for alternative energy, solar, wind, geothermal. The government created the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, a stockpile, hundreds of millions of barrels stored in underground salt caverns, insurance against future embargoes. The crisis reshaped American energy policy permanently. The age of cheap oil was over. Everyone knew it. The question was, what came next? Meanwhile, Kissinger was negotiating. Shuttle diplomacy, flying between capitals, talking to Israelis, talking to Egyptians, talking to Syrians, talking to Saudis. The goal was a ceasefire, disengagement agreements, anything to lift the embargo. The Yom Kippur War officially ended October 26th with a UN Security Council resolution, but the embargo continued. The Arabs wanted more than a ceasefire. They wanted Israeli withdrawal. They wanted recognition. They wanted leverage in peace talks. Kissinger worked the phones, made promises, offered weapons to Saudi Arabia, modern fighter jets, tanks, missiles, sweeteners, bribes, whatever it took. By January 1974, he'd brokered a disengagement agreement between Egypt and Israel. Israeli forces would pull back from the Suez Canal. Egyptian forces would establish a limited presence in Sinai. It wasn't peace, but it was enough. March 18, 1974, Arab oil ministers met in Vienna. They debated. Some wanted to continue the embargo. Iraq argued for permanent pressure. Others wanted to lift it. Saudi Arabia led the faction favoring an end. King Faisal had made his point. Oil was a weapon, a powerful one, but it was also a business. Saudi Arabia needed revenue. The embargo was costing money, and the Americans were cooperating. Kissinger was pushing Israel. Progress was being made. Continuing the embargo risked backlash, military intervention, nationalization of Saudi assets. The king calculated, weighed risks, decided, March 19th, the embargo against the United States was lifted. Oil exports resumed, but the price didn't drop. The producers had reset the market. $11 a barrel was the new normal. The embargo lasted 5 months, but its effects lasted decades. The most immediate impact was inflation. Energy costs feed into everything. Transportation, manufacturing, heating, cooling. When oil prices quadrupled, the cost of goods exploded. The Federal Reserve was caught. Do they raise interest rates to fight inflation, or lower them to fight recession? They chose inflation. Raised rates made borrowing expensive. It worked, eventually, but it also deepened the recession. The economic malaise of the 1970s was born in the oil shock of '73, and it didn't end until Paul Volcker became Fed chairman in 1979 and broke inflation's back with 20% interest rates. A decade of stagnation, all triggered by 5 months without Arab oil. The geopolitical consequences were even more profound. The embargo proved that oil was geopolitical leverage, that resource-rich nations could punish industrial powers, that the post-colonial world had cards to play. After 1973, American foreign policy in the Middle East became energy policy. Supporting Israel was important, but so was maintaining relationships with Arab oil producers. The balance was delicate, constant. Every administration since Nixon has walked that tightrope. Selling weapons to Saudi Arabia while defending Israel, mediating conflicts, ensuring stability, because another embargo could cripple the economy. The oil weapon wasn't fired again, but the threat remained, and it shaped everything. Wars, alliances, treaties. The entire architecture of Middle East policy was built on preventing another October 1973. The embargo also changed how Americans thought about energy. Before 1973, gasoline was cheap and abundant, infinite. India after, it was finite and vulnerable. The muscle car era ended. Detroit started making smaller, fuel-efficient vehicles. Japanese imports surged. Toyota, Honda, Datsun. They were small, ugly, but they got 40 miles per gallon. Americans bought them. The big three scrambled. Ford introduced the Pinto. Chevrolet made the Vega, tiny cars with tiny engines. It was a cultural shift. Efficiency replaced power. Conservation replaced consumption. The federal government mandated fuel economy standards, corporate average fuel economy, CAFE standards. Every manufacturer had to meet minimum miles per gallon targets or pay fines. The internal combustion engine would dominate for 50 more years, but its dominance was no longer assumed. Alternatives were suddenly viable. OPEC itself was transformed. Before 1973, it was weak, divided. After, it was a cartel, a real one. It controlled prices, dictated terms. Oil-producing nations began nationalizing their oil industries, kicking out Western companies. Saudi Arabia took control of Aramco, the Arabian-American oil company. It had been owned by Chevron, Texaco, Exxon, and Mobil. By 1980, it was fully Saudi-owned. Other producers followed. Libya, Iraq, Kuwait, the Seven Sisters lost their dominance. The producers took the prize. For the next decade, OPEC set prices, coordinated production, acted like a monopoly. It didn't last forever. By the 1980s, non-OPEC production increased. Norway, the North Sea, Alaska, Mexico, competition returned. Prices fell. But OPEC had proven its power, and the world remembered. The 1973 oil shock was a turning point. It ended the era of American energy independence. It proved that economic power could flow from resource control. It showed that leverage isn't just military. It's structural. It's about controlling things people need and can't replace. The Arabs didn't defeat America in battle. They didn't need to. They just turned off the oil. And the most powerful economy on earth ground to a halt. Gas lines, inflation, recession, panic, all from a political decision made in Kuwait City and Riyadh. The oil weapon was real, and it worked. That's the lesson. Power isn't just about armies, it's about dependencies. And in 1973, America learned it had one it couldn't escape.